Let me introduce Damjan Jovanovic. I'm very happy to have you here as our guest for tonight. Damjan Jovanovic is an architect, graduated originally from Belgrade University, then went to study at the Städelschule Architecture Class in Frankfurt for graduate school. And he graduated there in 2014 with a distinction project which won the AIV Masterpieces Prize. And the project was called over the Grace, right?
Yeah, that was partially, yeah.
Partially. And it already started a research agenda which he then followed on right after when he joined the faculty staff at the Städelschule. The research is at the kind of intersection of architecture, software, and now also virtual reality. Yeah. Over the course of the last now almost 4 years at the Städelschule, Damjan not only taught in the first year of the graduate school, he also taught in the second year together with Johan Bettum and Daniel Birnbaum. Together with Daniel Birnbaum, he also did an art project, let's say, kind of revisiting the work, or one work of Marcel Deschamps, which is in the museum in Stockholm, where Daniel Birnbaum was chief curator, and brought that kind of reinterpretation to the Städelschule, to the famous Städelrundgang. So Damjan's work is between architecture, art, and software, and what is important to me somehow that I see I feel really old because there is a new school of thought and a new generation, kind of. Although I still feel relatively young, but compared to a generation which literally went through an education that is very different than the education that I received in the late 90s, early 2000s. Damjan, who really is special in that group of people of that generation, has an interest in architecture, an interest in software and the digital, but that interest is not primarily driven from a kind of maker's perspective, or kind of makers as in fabrication, as in making, which was very much so in the early 2000s. I seem to belong to, but it starts to ask questions back into architecture, and is probably more related to the kind of field of drawing representation in architecture rather than in the fabrication and making. Although this generation is totally aware of that, and as Peter Trümmer once said, this generation is kind of the best multitaskers anyway, and where we can only kind of focus on one or two things, the kind of master of many fields. So I'm very much looking forward to see what Damjan has to offer tonight. Please welcome Damjan Jovanovic.
Thank you. So thank you very much for the invitation and the introduction. So I want to start from this just brief explanation of where I work. I work as a tutor at the Städelschule Architecture Class for the last 4 years. And I usually work with around 30 students in the first year and around 10 students in the second year. So this talk will be, half of this talk will be devoted to the kind of historical grounding of some of the ideas that I'm working with, and half of the talk will be basically kind of a showcase of the work from the studios that I'm doing with my students. So the work that we do in the school is devoted to this kind of history of experimental architectural design. And we see this as a long history coming from back many centuries ago to Alberti, basically. And this Albertian tradition of focusing on drawing and architectural image making in kind of the broadest sense of idea. But also, we're focusing on writing in the kind of disciplinary sense of architecture. So in this way, a project becomes more like a site of culture rather than just a technical description of producing the architecture. So much of what I do now is a response to my time when I was a student in the Städelschule. When I first started as a student in 2012, the first year studio that I was kind of introduced to was under the influence of a certain idea of parametricism. And I think everyone knows what that might mean. One thing is interesting with parametricism for me is that projects were evaluated in the tradition of modernism, and the digital project was posited as a continuation of this modernist idea of problem solving. So as I understood at that time, one of the ways to make a project, or at least how it was evaluated in the juries, was to construct some kind of a quasi-scientific argument that was based on the idea of kind of optimization and some kind of a goal-oriented process. And this process then corresponds to a technically very complex, elaborate parametric model, which was then presented through a series of kind of seductive images that were never argued like that, but were always kind of on the back side of this project. So the model itself was usually black boxed into a grasshopper component, and the project was argued for its representation qualities, for its spatial effects, basically, without kind of making that statement obvious. Or at least that's how I read, as a student, some of the things that we did. Obviously, this is a very subjective view, so don't take my word for it. So what was really interesting in this idea for me was that the relationship between the image production and the production of meaning, or the production of some kind of a text that will go with the project, was always treated as a one-to-one kind of collapse. It was always treated as a given condition. There was no gap between these two things somehow. And this, of course, then means for me, personally, that kind of the fictional ground of that metaphor was never addressed, which I will explain this further. But I think there was a missed opportunity to the kind of potentially interesting mismatches between images that were produced and the narratives that are then attached to these images. So the project in the end becomes some kind of a scientific illustration with captions, and never addresses the fiction, the kind of the very absurd situation that you're in a school making a project for a non-existing client. So this kind of making never addresses this utterly fictional component of project making in the academic sense. And this, I thought, was a very important contemporary moment, especially when it comes to this idea of education. What kind of architecture should we kind of teach, or can we talk about? What kind of project is there, and so forth. So I saw this idea of let's say parametricism in the strict sense as some kind of an overtaking of the representational space of architecture by the positivist normative kind of let's say ideologies, but it's more like a belief system or a thought process. And I saw these things embedded in the tools of design and the tools of production. So an example of this would be, as everyone knows, a grasshopper component. And a grasshopper component is basically a graph, directed mathematical graph that has a series of inputs and an output. So which means that in and of itself, it's some kind of a goal-oriented diagram. It goes from one side to the other. There is certain inevitability of that. And I was interested just in kind of seeing what else could be done with the digital. So this became a working question for me. What could be a project as a work of culture within the contemporary digital kind of regime? And that's where this idea of the tool or software becomes useful as a concept. So it became important for me, as Mirko said, to kind of consider design software as a central problem of contemporary visual culture, instead of merely some kind of a tool for optimizing fabrication or for kind of rationalizing form. So, and I was interested in two ways of doing that, basically. So one idea is that software produces a new idea of surface in architecture, and a second idea is that software produces the new idea of space in architecture. And the idea of space of the digital is very important to me, and this is what I want to talk about now with this kind of more theoretical introduction that I will make after this. So I would like to talk about this idea of space first, in order to explain why I think that the project of the digital needs to kind of change slowly. In this sense, I want to point out something that I call a weak metaphor, and the weak metaphor is the one that kind of constructs a relation between a computational process and a natural process, or between the code or the algorithm on the one side and kind of the text or meaning or semantics on the other side. So I work with this idea that these two things are kept separately because I couldn't find a way to actually relate them into this one-to-one kind of collapse. So I'm interested in the digital on its own terms and related not to some authenticity of like underlying mathematics of it and so forth, but related to the qualities that belong to the history of representation, which is, I think, what the architectural discipline is grounded in the end. So especially how it produces, if it does produce a new idea of space. So let's talk about space for a moment. And in this talk, I will take a kind of a constructivist position. And what that means is a simple idea. I will propose an idea to you that what we think of space is actually an entirely constructed idea. It's a complete fiction, but it's a fiction that has become real on its own terms. So as with any other fiction, this one also starts from the real. And what I mean by this becomes clear if we take geometry as an example. In the very beginning, in the ancient Greece, for example, geometry was inseparable from the land, from the real ground. It was the discipline of land measurement. It was the map of some kind of the real territory. And this territory comes before the map and clearly defines everything about the map. But then what happens is interesting. Geometry becomes a rule-based formal system, which means that it becomes self-contained knowledge. And it kind of discovers its own internal logic and rules that you cannot actually find in nature. So this makes it into a kind of separate disciplinary content. And then geometry starts producing coherences, new things, basically, that have little to do with observable reality. So abstractions like triangles and internal logics of triangles and so forth. So this is what I mean by fiction. It starts from the real, it finds its own language, and then it takes off into producing other kind of unforeseeable results. So I think space is an idea, is such a fiction as well. For architecture, I think the least interesting idea is this idea of space as the so-called lived experience. The one that we all somehow share and return to our minds when we think about space. This is what they call phenomenological space. I think for us as architects, this is probably the most useless notion in architecture, because it refers back to some authentic territory that we have left kind of behind many millennia ago. And I'm saying it's useless because we cannot access this space. We cannot actually work with this space except through some form of representation or mediation, which also means construction. So this is a diagram that shows you the kind of the architectural idea of representation. Because traditionally representation works as an idea of bringing a real object onto the plane of reference in order to kind of have an image of this object. In architecture, it works the other way around. architecture always works from a map to produce some kind of real territory. And basically, this means that it works through kind of various apparatuses and platforms that have their own content and politics. This is how representation works. So the reverse arrow, it goes from the author into the world. So design actually does this work of projecting ideas onto the world. And this projection or construction is what makes space in the end. In architectural design, the only way we can actually meaningfully talk about space is through means of its construction, projection and geometry. And this means through tools of representation. So since Alberti, and I have mentioned him in the beginning, tools and mediums of representation are the primary domain of architectural design. Architecture constructs its real through these methods, and by doing that, it constructs the world at the same time. This means that abstract space comes before real space. So a funny story that people used to say about this idea of fictions is that, for example, you can relate this idea of representation of space to the idea that no one ever died from tuberculosis before tuberculosis was discovered and described. It just didn't exist anymore, before. So in the same way, space did not exist before Alberti invented it. And Panofsky talks about the new spatial paradigm that was made through linear perspective by contrasting Renaissance painting with that of kind of medieval idea of painting. You can see here that before Renaissance, there was no idea of space. The idea of the world was kind of thought to be this juxtaposition of bodies that were set in a divine medium. Space was a simple superposition of these different bodies. It was very unsystematic. And with linear perspective comes an abstract spatial system that is now capable of ordering objects onto this kind of mechanism. So this is the invention of space, according to at least Peter Eisenman. All space is homogeneous, meaning that all objects exist within a consistent and calculable medium. So modern space was then invented through the invention of perspective in the 15th century. Perspective is, at its core, a very incredible idea of automating kind of sight itself. This is very interesting because it is this incredible idea of producing artificial vision through decoupling, through kind of divorcing the apparatus of seeing from the biology of looking by a kind of organism. This is another idea of abstraction kind of taking off from the real and becoming something in of itself. So perspectival vision has produced modern idea of space by describing the rules of seeing mathematically. But it also has produced what we call the modern idea of the subject. And this is now important. As we have seen until now, vision should now never be understood as a simple extension of our biological or phenomenological sense of immersion in the world or sight. It should always be understood as kind of a fully fledged abstraction that contaminates and kind of takes over the world by rewriting how we see and kind of how we engage with the reality by introducing its own default conditions. So an important thing about perspective, actually, is not that it simulates some natural real, but that it actually produces a new kind of real. So I think this is exactly the same as with software. And Cartesian space is a further abstraction of perspectival space. So the interest in a coordinate system and in kind of bodies developed through perspective corresponds to this idea of Descartes founding a coordinate system for mathematics and his translation of bodies into geometric figures. And as you might know, this idea of thinking about the world also introduces this split between mind and body, the so-called Cartesian dualism, the mind-body problem. And we'll talk more about this when we talk about VR. But for now, we need to understand that this is a space that is geometrically isotropic, rectilinear, abstract, and uniform. So, with Descartes, space is not about situating and representing objects anymore. It's a thinking that introduces a spacing within space. It's how we think about the space in which subjects and objects come into being. And to understand this, we need to understand another invention by Descartes. Because another thing that he did was really interesting. He's the first one that abstracted numbers from spatial relations. So it's another idea of fiction taking off. Because what happened is that from the ancient Greece to the kind of the scholastic period, numbers were always signs that were in reference to objects. So numbers were a property of matter and not objects in themselves. A number was always a unit length of like a line, or it was always some area, or it was some volume. It was never just a number. And Descartes eliminates this need that numbers relate to things. This idea of relationalism is kind of disturbed. This is how formal systems come into being. As we have seen from perspective, formal system becomes operative when it takes off from reality, when it kind of becomes internally logical. And then it produces something we call a Cartesian subject, which is this privileged, fixed, all-seeing beholder that kind of controls the space in front of him and so forth. And then Panofsky says that this correlation between linear perspective and Cartesian philosophy you can understand as being about the same topic. It's actually talking about the same idea, which is this kind of universal space. So what does that mean for architecture? In the beginning, it starts by Brunelleschi, and he starts using architectural figures such as buildings, ceilings, tiled floors, and so forth to match the grid structure of the projective plane. And later, as this progresses further on, other objects, they become fitted and shaped within the geometrical patterning of this linear perspective. And you know this from your own education and from your own history, even as probably a child. By drawing a perspective drawing, you have already defined kind of the diagram of possibilities of that space. So, and what happens then is very interesting for architecture, because the obvious tension becomes clear, is that it's a tension between the grid that represents space and the figure or objects that you have to put into that space. And this becomes the problem of kind of next 5 centuries of architecture. How to put an object onto the grid, which is what we call the relation of the grid and the figure. So one important default that is introduced through this Cartesian logic is the idea of the plan view. As we know, the Cartesian logic has not only the perspective, but it's suddenly also introduces orthographic projections. So the plan view brings with it kind of its apparatus this idea of total control of the model space. And you can understand, if you know this project, and how it's actually very good at promoting any idea that has to do with central hierarchy, centralized political authority. So all kind of ideas of Roman city planning, centrally planned temples, the ideal villa of Palladio, all the grid diagrams, they are kind of planar diagrams. They belong to this Cartesian idea of the plan. And what happens in modernism is this idea that plan becomes finally the generator of form with Le Corbusier. And kind of an idea of infinite free space is born. So, which means free elements in homogeneous space. An initial diagram of modernist space is the grid, and how these objects are composed onto the grid becomes this idea of free space. Mies van der Rohe's version is called universal space, which is kind of the same idea, with a different kind of ideological bend, which is that Nicene space is bound by its only by its kind of outer limit. That's why he places columns on the outside of the building. That's why there are free elements positioned in the grid, because he wants to actually produce this kind of empty idea of infinite volumetric space of the container, or the framed container. Some other kind of projects like Archizoom's Non-Stop City take this idea of the grid into complete kind of they have this possibility of making a kind of a utopian version of a city that consists only of a plan. So you see in this plan, which is called a non-figurative plan, there are no buildings. It's only furniture that is kind of dispersed as confetti through the infinite extension of the grid. So there is no boundary. There is only beginning of like a total interior space. And because this project is from the 60s, you understand the idea of total interior as being determined by also other factors that I'm going to talk about now. And in the case of Super Studio, architecture becomes only the grid. There are no objects anymore. This is the most symbolic project of modernity. The grid becomes architecture, and architecture becomes only the image. It's the final kind of celebration of the grid. And as with Archizoom, it's the idea of liberation of man from architecture. It's finally, we don't need architecture. The only thing we need is that the modernist project, the project of kind of, that started with Alberti, that finally becomes real into this as an infinite extension grid. So what happens meanwhile is also interesting, because so far we've been talking about space, but something happens to vision, the idea of looking at space too. And this is what I mentioned at the beginning, this process of automation of vision that starts with perspective. So if perspective starts with this idea that you can make an abstract diagram of how humans see, then this is the next step, which is camera obscura. Vision becomes even further removed from kind of real human vision. It becomes another way of representing space until it actually becomes kind of internally coherent through its own language of photography and cinema that kind of still produce a Cartesian origin, but then they start adding new elements, like this idea of multiplication of vision, montage, collage, different spaces in the same frame. Another idea of how to look at the world that comes from this history of vision that we have seen. So these new vision apparatuses that appear in the 20th century, or let's say 19th century, and you all know them, obviously, microscope, telescope, this idea of extending human vision into other realms, they produce new ideas of the real as well. So this film is the kind of ultimate expression of the pre-digital automation of vision. So you can understand this, the story of this film only if you know that the story is possible because we have these mediums of satellite microscope representation. So the only way to describe a world through this film is because we have these tools that allow us to look at the world differently. And in this film, what happens is that the same scene is viewed through these powers of 10. So it goes kind of into the ultimate zoom out into the galaxies, and then it goes back into the ultimate zoom in into atoms and things that are very, very tiny. So it kind of makes the full circle. So in the end, the apparatus of software is where all of this history actually goes. This is my point. That's what I was telling you, this entire history of perspective and vision and representation. So software is that thing that has all of these histories inside of it. And it brings a new idea of vision as well, which is what we can call the game vision. If you play computer games, you know what I'm talking about. It's the idea that you can now move through space by your own kind of design. You don't have to just look at things kind of passively anymore. It brings a new mode of relating to visual culture that has this idea of multidimensional, multi-axial access to space. So this is a game where you can become any object in this world, from the very big to the very small, from the very banal to kind of very profound. And so it goes into these multiple zoom in and zoom outs. What I want to just point out is that it's a different space, if you think about it as an abstract space, than it was in the previous example of the Eames film. It's called The Powers of Ten. Because that film has just a zoom out and zoom in possibility, because it was based on the idea of microscope and telescope. This one is based on the idea of software, so it has all kinds of possible spaces embedded in it. Okay. So what about the space of the digital, right? That's the question. So this is, I mean, this topic is still very much in development, basically. So the digital has this, when it started in the late 80s, early 90s, it had this idea that it brings a new idea of space for architecture. Because it was producing something that we can call multiple, inconsistent multiple, as Eisenman would say, which means that it produces repetition of objects that are not the same. So because Alberti's idea was to produce a single design by a single author, computation has the capacity to produce multiple designs that are not the same, but then introduces another idea of authorship which is based on selection rather than production. So one thing is new with the digital, and that wasn't there before in the history of representation. In software, we have the possibility of modeling objects in real time interactively. So an object is not only placed on the grid, like in the history of architecture, but can be interactively operated as well. So the user can move around, orbit, zoom, and so forth. You all know this, but I will just propose to you one thing is that this is actually a radical idea. And I will try to tell you why. Why I think so is because this interactive projection actually liberates the space that you can produce from the constraints of fixed projection systems. So that creates very interesting spatial outcomes. Because in the traditional sense, the relationship between the plan and the facade was defined by the projective planes of the plan and the elevation. And in this sense, in this new mode of vision, this relationship is completely changed. And then the facade becomes either an intentional cut through this volume, or is literally just an envelope of a 3D object. We can call this the unification of model space. And this is what enables different outcomes than what was possible in a time when space was modeled in separate orthographic views. And I argue that this changes the default of space from planar to volumetric. So this is now my critique of UN Studio that you will enjoy. My kind of point, let's say a point I have to make is that these forms come out not from the possibility of the kind of algorithm that produces them, but I think they come out of this idea of the volumetric access to space that is embedded in software, which is this idea. It gives birth to the idea of continuous envelope, because suddenly you can actually model these things from any side. You don't have a fixed access to them anymore. Okay, so this I have said. So from this perspective of talking, traditional design was, we can think about it as a special method where you have to first design in separate orthographic representational realms and then make an object from them. And another problem you have is the problem of how you make a 3D form, right? And the modernist grid is a perfect example. You can only produce a 3D form by either stacking the space onto the z-axis or by extruding the space. So this project is designed on the basis of the volumetric software diagram. So the plan is no longer the generator as it was in modernism. The plans and sections and other kind of conventional diagrams of architecture are produced after the model is produced. So if the traditional flat diagram of space is a fragmented model space, it works through stitching of these projections into an object. It has a bidirectional operation, which means that it's a plan thing. It has a planar continuity. Then a volumetric or software diagram has a unification of model space. It obscures kind of traditional relations between projections, and it has multi-directional idea of space as a new default. So, no one really talks about this, but I think it's important. I think we need to understand the project of a digital comes out of a history that has more to do with kind of military conquest of space than it has to do with anything else. So radar technology is the origin of computer graphics. And I want to point out two important things here. One is that radar has a function of control as a default. Because it's a first machine, it's a first technology where you can actually not only look at the image, but you can select a pixel on that image. So you can put a pointer onto a specific pixel of that image. And the other one, which is more profound, is that radar technology proves that light is not needed for vision. So the abstract apparatus of vision has nothing to do with light, actually. It's only geometry that produces vision. "3D software as a basis, every 3D software is based on grids. And as it was, as every other kind of graphic procedure for making architecture was, 3D software has the same logic. And now this is like a polemical point that I'm trying to make, is that every object that you make in the digital is a grid. And all these objects are also placed on a flat Cartesian grid. So this is what actually defines the space. You can see it here in this kind of overview of modeling tools. All these design softwares, they reproduce conventions of Cartesian space. So the space that you can produce through them remains defined by this convention. And also, then we can talk about this later, this also reproduces kind of aesthetic and political effects of that history. So the space of the digital might just be kind of an extension of the Cartesian space, of something that was always there. We can say this, that design software kind of reproduces in a much more accessible way this historical idea of homogeneous space through the double work that is then performed by this mode of vision that I explained and the grid. So design in this world has the same problem as it always had, which is how to make a relationship between the grid and the figure on the grid. But now, the observer, the one who looks at this model space, is not is kind of not fixed, because we can now manipulate this the access to this space too. You can see this very clearly in this kind of example of Google Earth VR, which is a very advanced tool for experiencing the representation of the world, right? You can see that the truth, the authenticity of it is simply the same grid that was always there in architecture. So this is my kind of grim point that I have to make, is that digital space is an elaborate version of the Cartesian space. In digital space, we become kind of prisoners within this endless interior that reproduces all of these historical things that we know, and so forth. Yes. So how can we resist? How can we do something with this, right? Now comes the interesting part. In the pre-digital era, so I'm sure that you know this project. This is a very important series of drawings by Daniel Libeskin called Micromegas. And in this, I see this project as some kind of a resistance to this default, because he uses this kind of idea of multiple projections, collage strategies, chance encounters between these elements to kind of produce new ideas of space. And there is a series of these projects from the 60s and 70s that I am interested in, basically. Another one is a project by Bernard Tschumi called Manhattan Transcripts. So my kind of idea is that these drawings were made as means to overcome the flatness and representational kind of prison of the traditional apparatus of architectural design that was at that time made from kind of plan sections, perspectives, isometric drawings, and so forth. So they were trying to do something to escape that space that was given to them by these defaults. I think that the most explicit project that does that is Peter Eisenman's kind of series of projects that deal literally with the grid. And I think this is very important for his project, is that there is a reason that he literally takes the grid and works with the grid. Because I mean, this is also one of the, not this particular one, but this idea is the birth of deconstructivist architecture, I think, is to kind of destroy the default that was kind of given to you by the history of representation. So this is why they start using these kind of cutouts and you can see in this case that the grid is mutilated into another idea. So, and I think this is, so with Tschumi and with Libeskin, this idea of how to resist becomes part of that. So I think that in the digital project of architecture, another kind of resistance is what we need. Because we cannot simply go back to these things anymore. Simply because they were done at a time when this made sense. I think we need another idea of how to resist this logic. And I work with this idea of the assemblage, which is simply working with the same idea of default space, but suddenly now aggregating, agglomerating, or making these kind of accumulations of objects to produce another idea of space that might actually happen in the end. So now we get into the more detailed description of the actual work. I'm sorry if this was kind of too long, but I had to get it off my chest so that we can look at the work, so that you get a little bit of context of why these kind of images that you will see from now on, why they might make sense or why they might not make sense, and so forth. So I'm going to show you these three different kind of parts, and this is three different briefs that I have in my studio at the Städelschule: translations, search space, and object. And these are kind of three different workflows, let's say. The first one is a kind of modeling of this kind of very high resolution 3D object. And in the first one, we focus on this idea of whole surface, high resolution subdivision. And kind of the workflow is based on the classical ideas of virtuosity and expertise of making a form. So in this part, we start directly from images. So this is now important to understand as a workflow idea. We don't make this project based on something outside of the image. We start from the images directly, which is why we have this kind of three tasks. And I'm going to talk about the third task, which is kind of transforming a painting into a 3D model. Because it's an important thing, because in this case, I want to kind of work with this idea of aesthetic interest of a student and what someone is interested in visually and so forth. So this task has a very simple idea. Find a painting and then make a volumetric object by reproducing the literal or implied qualities of space, mass, contour, edge, line, texture, color, shadow, so forth, and then also make a possible interior of this space. So it's a translation of an image into a massive high-resolution subdivision volume. And in this case, there was a painting by this surrealist painter Yves Tanguy that was translated into an object based on this idea of plastic alphabet that a student developed. So in this way, we produce these objects that kind of belong to this idea of high resolution abstraction or high definition abstraction. And so this is an interesting point because the tools that we can use today can overproduce effects, or they can overproduce geometry. They can produce so much complexity that basically there is no kind of rational way of connecting that output with any kind of meaningful ground for interpretation. So the thing becomes to actually make an interpretation based on the image itself rather than some underlying origin of the image. So the goal is to find ways to approach these images, try to discipline them, and then find a position that kind of we can speak about them through their formal and spatial qualities only. So it's pure form, pure space, and a result is explicitly always a set of images that are positioned between a painting, drawing, and a rendering. So we kind of try to mix traditional conventions of what it means to make a representation in architecture. Also, one result is kind of a narrative that a student constructs from close reading of formal properties. And I mean, this is important too. So in this case, for example, the model is made as an explicit blend between surface geometry and freehand sketching. So layering multiple representation techniques as literal surface elements. So this is, when you see it like this, it's a section, but it actually is a fully modeled kind of object. There, you know, this is, I mean, but once you actually represent it, you cannot tell if it's a hand drawing or if it's a rendering or if it's a model. This is the kind of another example of that, where one painting is transformed into this aggregate based on a specific reading. And sometimes the translation is formally very precise. It kind of revolves around the reconstruction of implied space of the painting into this kind of highly polychromatic constructed object. Such as also in this case, for example. we also do these kind of speculative reinterpretations of certain historical objects into kind of robotic figures or... Okay. So what is interesting in all of these cases is that the set of visual qualities comes out of a formal reading of the space, texture, color, and it's based on the articulations of the original, as you can see here. And the idea is to make a completely new object with an internally coherent set of properties that then becomes a basis of the later work. So you take an image, you make an object out of the image, but then you forget about the original image and you use this object as the basis for what comes after that. Then the second workflow is what I developed through this custom-made kind of software that I designed. It's called Platform Sandbox. And this software is made in Unity, kind of game engine, I think everyone probably knows. And this works through this idea of sampling and remixing digital ready-made found objects online or modeled and kind of deployed into these non-deterministic chance procedures that we work with. So this oh, that was a video, sorry. Okay, so this software actually operates more like a pedagogical tool and a thinking tool than as a goal-oriented process, something that I mentioned at the beginning. So I use this gaming engine to set a condition of default that will make available kind of different forms of engagement with the digital. So you can see in this, how in the beginning it kind of looks familiar. There is this idea of placing objects onto the grid. There is this idea of kind of engagement with what you know somehow, what you can anticipate. The point is obviously that all of the objects you can see there, they are imported from the outside and they have to be made by the student. There are no primitives that are used. And then there is a series of these completely chaotic operations that start then to produce another idea of like what it means to kind of produce the assemblage. This is one of them where objects are kind of held in this kind of spherical kind of aggregate form. So the user interface is designed to kind of look like a standard default software, but the software itself actually works more like a game. Because I'm working with games, because the games actually put into question this idea of subjective agency and authorship that was given to us by the default that was there somehow. Because games question the player. Usually, they kind of also what they can do is disturb the idea of what the goal is, what you can do with something. So this is kind of the overview of the rules of the game, functions, possible outcomes from this software, and the types in the end. You can see kind of 12 different types that can be produced, and they're very loosely defined. They're not very precise, and that's on purpose. So the idea of play is what I work with, and through this engagement with randomness, chance operation, fake physics, this becomes kind of an essential argument. And students then spend 2 weeks kind of working with this tool by also learning to use the gaming framework that produces the tool. And how we begin is by student chooses a building or an architect, and then selects, finds or models kind of 7 to 10 characteristic objects from this architect that should be linear and then flat and volumetric. So different library of these forms. For example, in this case, this is a James Sterling library of objects. And then through these interactions, different kind of diagrams can be produced. Kind of piles, stacks, and so forth. These aggregates that I mentioned, they have different names, and we try to see the differences, like meaningful differences between them too. What is interesting about this is that every design session is limited to 20 minutes. After 20 minutes, everything is deleted. You have to do another object. And you can imagine that students kind of don't like that too much. And some of them even ask me to kind of extend the, But I think 20 minutes is more than enough today to produce an architecture project. So, especially in this kind of setting. And then you can actually export kind of screenshots and geometry from this software and so forth. These are all screenshots from the software. In the end, it becomes this idea of what you want to make, not what, because you could make many different types of things, but through these 20-minute sessions that usually actually last for 5 minutes, to be honest, students make a lot of these objects, and then it becomes, after a certain amount of tries, you end up making just things that you actually like. This is kind of a blasphemy in Germany, but this object was made out of remixing Gottfried Böhm's religious architecture. So, I'm sorry to say that. And this one is kind of a remix of Boulez, who's this French classicist architect. These are various works done from James Sterling. So the most important thing about this workflow is that all of these now are screenshots. They're not rendered after. All of them are just, there is one button that you press and you get that image. So this is something that I was interested in, to see how we can work with software as a drawing tool, as a tool that produces finished drawings without the need to go to Photoshop, go to Illustrator. So in the end, this is what happens. After like 2 weeks of work, there are 6,300 of these models, screenshots, which is a massive amount of drawings that is produced. And this is what I call search space, because this kind of idea of production needs another idea of selection from options. So if the first workflow that you saw with these kind of massive painting objects was about virtuosity, was about precise modeling, was about kind of making something for an extended period of time, this one is the opposite of that. It's dirty, rapid, fast modeling within a large possibility space where it's not clear how you select. You also have to come up with this idea of how you select objects. And objects are not elaborate, they're sketchy, they have a sketchy quality. I wanted this to be more like a, when you type into Google search engine something and you get a massive amount of images, you're presented with this idea of you have to choose an image that will correspond to what you thought, what you were looking for, right? So if you look for architecture in the Google search engine, you will get 30 million images that somehow relate to the idea of architecture. And then the question for you as someone who is Googling becomes like, how do I pick one, Or how do I pick multiple of what am I interested in here? So with this software, I had a similar idea to make that kind of space. So this is from around 30 students. So each student will then have a couple of hundred of these screenshots, or let's say objects. And then they have to start grouping them into some meaningful categories that they have to think about. And then the final part is, and this is the work of the whole semester now. The final part of the semester is this idea to make a third object that will mix between these two different things. So between the painting complex geometry and the kind of this aggregate object made in the second part. So this final part is where we get this kind of imperfect mixed objects. And then what is interesting here for me is, personally, is this, once you're presented with workflows such as these, like, you have to find a way to meaningfully present your work as a student and to talk about your work too. And one of the actual things that you can say if you're a student is you can make an internally coherent body of work, which means that you will make certain objects that have similarities between them in both of these workflows. And you will produce a third object that will kind of express what I would like to call what really interests you as an architect, right? So in this case, is a mix between a kind of a Duchamp interior multi-figure and an array assemblage that was made from Shin Takamatsu elements. And you have seen a screenshot before, and you have also seen the Duchamp painting at the beginning, and that's the one you get in the end somehow. It's like a plan of that. So a kind of a final object is thought to be something between a massive whole and a collection of parts. So it shouldn't be read as either just an aggregate or just the subdivision volume. It should be something in between. And because we are interested in retaining this ambiguity between high resolution and low resolution and surface articulation and kind of these additions and so forth. So in this case, this object is a mix between a Cy Twombly painting object and James Sterling aggregate assemblage. So there are various strategies of how students do this, and this is what I would like to call architectural knowledge, or let's say talent in the end, because how you bring things together is in the end important for me. So in this case, what happened is that the painting was a kit bash of multiple different figures. The platform work that comes is like an assemblage made out of these metabolist Japanese elements. And to bring them together, the student invented this third element that composes them on a kind of a micro scale. And this is it's a kind of a capsule element that you can see there in the middle that connects between the hard surface parts of the assemblage and the kind of the soft body character from the kit bash. Okay. And then this is very fast now. Like in the second semester, what happens, with these three kind of sets of exercises or workflows, in the second semester, there is a project that kind of learns from that. And we usually make a project for a kind of a small public building as an exercise. That means that these objects then they become reworked from zero. So still with the same workflow, but now they include more specific architectural interest. And this is where we talk about kind of disciplinary questions like figure ground, inside outside, part to whole relations, the idea of ambiguity of scale, the interstitial space, and like multiple figurations that happen on the inside of the void and so forth. So one of the ideas I'm interested in also is to kind of make this expertise within the student that is both about like craftsman making of a form that is intentional, that has a prolonged period of engagement, but also, on the other hand, to work with this kind of easy, fast workflows that fit maybe today more with this idea of how we work today as architects. It's also very important to explore the kind of conventional means of representation in architecture. So all of these projects in the end, as projects, they become represented through highly detailed plans, sections, axonometrics, and so forth. Because we want to still talk to that history, that where we come from. This is important. Because we cannot escape this idea of architectural discipline. And I think what we want with this work is to kind of mobilize the dialogue between the possible other modes of digital with that history too. So for example, this is a remix of Le Corbusier's Chandigarh building, where some of the elements change meaning. So a facade that was originally kind of a big colonnade of these kind of Corbusian elements becomes kind of railing and so forth. There is kind of ironic play of repurposing elements and putting them into a different context. In this case, it's a building that is a rework of Hans Scharoun's Philharmonie project that takes that landscape plan of the building and makes it into a section, and then works of this volume through kind of layering of these shells and multiple openings and so forth. And this is a cinema building that has a kind of an interior promenade that moves through the volume of different scale, containing private and public viewing spaces, and so forth. So this is the last image, by the way. So the goal of that whole work, I guess, is to talk about architectural project, the idea of the project, as a kind of a constructed fiction, as a work of culture that has its own internal rules and narratives. And so the project is a fiction not because it's kind of unbuilt or something, or because it doesn't have a truth, authenticity component. It's a fiction because it's constructed through these multiple modes of representation, and they all come from somewhere, but they then start producing their own internal results that we kind of surf on, So I guess I'm interested in getting into a dialogue with some of that through this work. So thank you. I'm sorry if that was too long, guys, but like.
Any questions? Then maybe I start with one. I think in the end you showed some projects. Let's exclude the last chapter for a moment, and maybe you can explain, especially coming from the context of an art school which has an architecture class, also having worked with Daniel Birnbaum on Duchamp and reworking art project. How is that work or method that you showed architectural or different than an artistic method?
Yeah, that's a great question. But so one of the things, that's I guess why I was interested in showing that history. It's more a speculative history really of mediums, and then because I think the architects have always worked through these heuristic kind of procedures that have more to do with interest that is about form and that is about like shaping of space or forming the space, then it's purely kind of scientific or engineering based one that has, that has kind of logical outcomes set out from logical procedures simply. And this is because what I thought was interesting in architecture was that it had this kind of multiple separations historically. Like the first separation was between Alberti and Brunelleschi, where Alberti was the one to just make drawings, and Brunelleschi was a master builder. He was building models. But then this idea of making drawings becomes important because that's where the culture was produced. In books and in prints and treatises, like 4 books of architecture. And the other thing was more about kind of problem solving, or making that dome in Florence that wasn't possible to be made before. And then I think what happens also in like 19th century is that engineering separates from architecture with concrete and with steel and with these new. But I think that the digital, when it appeared, introduced this idea of bringing these two together back again, because it was suddenly possible to think about fabrication and design at the same time. And I felt that a little bit what was the problem with this was that at one point it became a little bit like we have to wait for like BIM happened, basically, which is to say like you will design from the library of elements that are given to you by this and we know this will work because actually that was tried and tested, and people designing these elements are still working on it also. And I thought the parametricism also had a similar idea, which is it's about precision, it's about fabrication, it's about like putting things correctly into the world. And some of the works that I was interested in by Libeskind, by these people, I thought it was making a point not to be correct, like on purpose, because I thought that was the response to kind of high modernist, prefabrication idea where everything becomes the same, where everything becomes meaningful in the end. So, and this is, I think, why? Because I think we need this strategy of resistance within the digital, because the digital also became kind of a new modernism as well. So I thought maybe this kind of work also becomes a little bit like postmodern digital, a little bit, because we're trying to play with signification, we try to see what things mean, we try to kind of disturb them by shaking them up and making them a little bit absurd too. And maybe that's just because the power of that digital project that was developed in parametrism became too constricting, because it started becoming too normative. It started saying like this has to be done like that and so forth. That's why it comes from also the art school, because some of the procedures used in the art production are, I think we can learn from them. In the end, that's the.
But I like your notion of the fictional history. You're kind of embedding your strategies in, and I think it's very true. Because also the references you draw from Eisenman to Libeskind, which seem to be important, they also, you appreciate they kind of try to shake things up in modernism, which became too static or whatever, but still they operate just slightly outside the margins of modernism. Yeah? They still use that as their frame of context, which they used to get worked out. Other than some figures like Wilbur Woods in the 1890s, or pre-modern architects like Gaudi, who didn't even care about architecture history, which they always kind of remain outsiders in that discourse. So I think that's also, and I think that's where I see it being different to the arts, where in the arts there isn't really anymore such a kind of uniform ground or or ground where they all can somehow refer
Yeah.
to, and then just marginally step out. Yeah, whether it's modernism, whether it's parametricism, and people either try to kind of rewrite the fictional history, like Mario Kart was which already existed with Alberti and Nation, or you say it's kind of just a recast of modernism, and then you kind of also very witty kind of point out how this is a kind of post-digital postmodernism.
Yeah, because it goes back to, this is one of the things that I'm now, it goes back to some collage strategies that were, but I don't want to do collage also. Yeah. I mean, I would like to do something that goes beyond traditional collage, yeah.
One more question which might also be interesting to students here. How does that work settle with students who are have to, on one hand, learn still new techniques, because they're not only digital techniques, but they're digital techniques invented by you.
Yes.
Yeah? So there's no way to kind of already have that expertise when they come to you.
Yeah.
So they have to learn that. On the other hand, they also have to catch up on your fictional history of architecture.
Yeah. So there is, I mean, that's...
How do they do that? And
that it's a very, I mean, we have I mean,
what does it do to them?
we just talk a lot, you know. I mean, one thing is interesting because some of them come to the school thinking, yes, I will learn Rhino, I will learn Grasshopper, I will learn how to make this. Suddenly they're exposed to this idea that, like, no, let me show you a couple of tools that you will never use after this, ever, because they are kind of useless. But I will show you a couple of tools because I want you to start thinking about something else. And then obviously one of the things which makes this work is that it wouldn't be possible to be done if we didn't actually also use kind of traditional tools. Like if they didn't learn Rhino and Maya also, we couldn't do this. So there is also a kind of a backside where we go through the kind of convention too. But this is more like a thinking provocation for them to say, and I explain them also because I do kind of theory seminars with them, and until we get to this point where we can talk about how images are produced and how maybe the work today is not meant for architecture but is meant for like social media, or this idea of where do you want to deploy your work, where does your work, what is the context of your work. Some of the projects we do now, for example, we do in the second year, are done with this idea that we sample from Google Maps and then put objects back into Google Maps. But in between, we do like all kinds of techniques, from collage to like neural network processing, for example. And this is the idea of like becoming kind of not literate, but super nimble with images and with different tools. Instead of becoming a specialist in something that might not be in the end. There might be, that's something else, I don't know, I'm thinking about it. Who's the audience for some of the things that we do still in architecture school?
When the deconstructivists started doing their drawings in the 70s and made these hugely elaborate drawings, at some point in the 80s they came to a point where they actually had to produce buildings out of that. So they made a huge leap of abstraction to produce actual built architecture out of these previous drawings. If we take these techniques as what they did, but now with tools which allow us to get even more delicate than they did back then when they had to draw it with their hands. What's the next step? Is it a step of extraction to get that in a building, or is it a step of technology, or is it a step of maybe only experiencing it through augmented or virtual reality?
I mean, I think there are two things. One is to, for me at least it will be, one is to have an interesting daily life, So, and I think that was the project of like Coop Himmelblau. When they were like young, they were like rock and roll people. They take an image and they draw, you know, they wanted to engage with life differently. And this is, I think, the point would be that we say that we are living in a time where everything, like the proliferation of images, genres, subcultures, everything is exploding. And then in architecture still, you know, architecture is still late, or, you know, this is one of the things why we do this, to kind of make it fast also. But the other thing I think is more important for me is there will come a time where we might need to invent a new expertise of authorship. And this will have to do less with like automation, because the paradigm of machine, or let's say the computation that we have right now, goes into this idea of automation, that things will be automated, thus they will become more like better, right? But what if, and we are starting to see glimpses of that, I think, what if actually it's not about automation, but about another layer of creativity that will be produced by the machine? You know, and you can see this with like Deep Dream, with these kind of ideas, that suddenly you're starting to see images that fall outside of this narrative of like progress. Because the semantic idea, how you understand these images, is unclear to you. So I think if there is something that we should do as architects, also as educators, is to look into these modes of how we can talk about these new results, you know. And I think like by speeding up these procedures, by making like this vast search space of possibilities where it's not about being correct anymore, you know. It's not, because it's not, maybe not enough to be correct anymore. Maybe it's not enough to be right anymore also, you know. I mean, that's what I would say. Like, we might need another kind of heuristics that is not simply about like make it good or make it truthful. Maybe it's also, you know, it's also a political question, I guess. So that's how I see that, at least.
Any question?
You said that like every student made like, I don't know how many drawings from the second step, like 160 drawings.
Yeah, yeah, maybe more.
How fun is it? So, like how many hours do they have to invest into it?
Well, it's 2 weeks.
2 weeks.
So it's not too much.
Too much.
I mean, I would say it's not like too, because it might become kind of also, but I think it's pretty fun, because after we get into actual technicalities of it, and I think it becomes kind of interesting to them as well.
Because I know, like, from my own experience and also like an experience of like in teaching CAD, that like for many people learning the CAD software can be very frustrating.
Yeah.
But maybe that's a better way to teaching it, by making it fun, by just giving them like the final project is just like a fun thing, and like first they obviously have to make the first steps of modeling like small elements or things, and then it just like becomes just like they just forget about this, and then they just do stuff.
Yeah. No,
So
you're right completely. I mean,
I feel like that might be a good point in teaching digital tool software, because sometimes I feel like many people get really just like in.
So can I ask you something? Why don't you like working in AutoCAD?
Because it's just like so strict. Right?
So it's incredibly boring, right? Like it's just incredibly boring, actually. And you look at that black screen and you're like, oh my god, right? But do you play computer games?
I I did when I.
No, it's fine. You can say you do.
No, I actually haven't played it.
Okay. Well, but you know how much fun it is to play a computer game?
Yeah.
That's the point. I mean, this kind of the only. I mean, that's why I mentioned Coop Himmelblau, and in that because they wanted this idea that, like, obviously, when you have a real project with real clients with real responsibilities, then you have to find new ways of working, obviously, that are different. But while you're actually interested in just learning about things, you can still have fun with it, right?
But that's the thing. Do we need to make this shift towards actually constructing in the future?
Well, I mean, I did have this idea that for a while, that I'm not interested in building at all. I'm just interested in making images or experiences in VR, or But recently, after I was exposed to VR now it's more than a year that I work with VR. I don't like VR anymore. I don't really like VR. And then I went to Venice recently and I saw a couple of Carlos Scarpa projects, and that's actual, it's like real. It's fantastic. So I don't know. I think partially.
So after all, there's a phenomenological component to it.
It's life, But I mean, I would say that what is important is to kind of separate realms, at least for a while, like education, design, and then obviously one has to. That's why I'm trying to find ways of working with these new ideas that are not with these new regimes. That's the idea. That's why it's called platform, right? It's a kind of an ironic idea because now it's all platforms. Like you're going on Facebook, or Instagram, you're clicking, you're liking things, you have an experience, and what's actually happening in the background is something completely different. And I think we need to talk about that too, through some of these things. Because this could also become just a way of making boring things funny, like gamifying things, and so then it's a problem of labor, of politics, and all that stuff.
You made the point that parametricism is getting even more and more about optimizing things and automating. Do you see the future of this development in computers and AI taking more and more of the design process and automating it? And is your process kind of a reaction to this, to kind of bring back this irrational human?
Exactly what it is. I could have said that and no, but it's true. It's true. But I don't like the word irrational because it refers to something that is kind of hidden in the background. Like Freudian thing, like there is an irrational and we have to talk about it from the background. I think now we're talking about surface stuff that is crazy today. Like Donald Trump, yeah? That's not background. That's like foreground. So I think that's what I mean. I think we need another expertise with dealing with these things. And like how people train their visual cortex today is like through first-person computer games, for example. So if you want to, if you could compare the visual cortex of a gamer with anyone from history, you would see that this guy is like an evolutionary giant compared to anyone. Like even people like Dürer, because it's a different idea of speed, and I think we have to mobilize that too, to talk about that.
So you were building this history of the pre-modern aggregation. It was the word aggregation.
Yeah.
And then since Alberti, in these 500 years of architecture was the history of how the figure relates with the grid, as you said.
Yeah.
I would like to know, in terms of spatial qualities, what differs the assemblage that you are proposing from the pre-modern aggregates?
Pre-modern? You mean?
Pre-Alberti aggregates.
You mean like medieval?
Yeah. So
Well, I mean,
the aggregate and
yeah.
the assemblage, what differ there?
I mean, that's an interesting question. I think because like there is an interesting point about the pre-perspectival spaces in Italy, for example, that were not made from design. Like in Pisa, the square, you know, it was made as an aggregation of objects in real time. And I think this is what you mean by pre-modern aggregate, right? It's like a medieval idea. So I guess, you know, I guess what is different is that now we have to, I mean, now we have another, you know, access to that space. That because the space at that time was made, you know, was made as a kind of a natural deposit after, you know, through generations. It wasn't made from a plan, or it wasn't made from some kind of an idea. It was made more like, I mean, there was obviously an idea, but there was always a struggle between what we can make and what we actually want to make. So I guess in this case, it's more about also like producing large quantities of those too. But that you can actually trace back to their initial like origin idea.
So are you accelerating?
I think. No, I think this is a complete accelerationist idea, definitely. But like to what end, I'm not sure.
Why do you have a freeze on that, for example?
Because it's always there anyway. I don't think we escape the grid. There is one. I mean, I'm now looking into cognitive science and stuff like that. I mean, there is one thing where people are now talking about like multidimensional mapping of the brain, how brain represents an idea, and I think software has to go into that direction because now software that we now have is a reproduction of the Cartesian idea of the mind, you know. Like the mind is something. So the mind-body duality. Body is outside and mind is inside. And then the world is you look at the world through this apparatus of your eyes, and you look at an object, you bring it inside of your mind into one space, and then you observe it somehow and you judge it, right? But then this multiple maps idea talks about multiple dimensions that are producing this. So I think the software also has to be more like that, you know, like because it's such a simplistic representation that we have of that space, which is still Cartesian space.
And do you think gaming brings the body back?
I thought that game by David O'Reilly kind of does that a little bit, because it puts you into many positions in space, you know, in multiple zones, not only just like one or two, but any. And I thought that was radical, because it's. Imagine if you had a software that designs like that, where you literally can just inhabit the entirety of that space.
But even not the difference of design on software or on paper that we can zoom in and zoom out forever. For example, now for so many years zooming out.
Yeah, but it's more like being in the other place also. You know, which is there somehow. I don't know.
But then when we talk about this new digital artisanship or whatever,
yeah,
where we use a tool as a software tool as a means of interacting with matter and aggregating matter, then the question about authorship comes like way back to us.
Yeah.
Who is the author? Is it the author of the tool? Is it the author of this specific thing? Or doesn't it matter?
It's shared.
Or is it just an idea of getting out as many tools as possible and then seeing...
You know, one of the things, and I didn't mention that, so one of the things is that it's like a flat authorship idea. That's why I tell the students, you can always say these are your projects, you know?
Yeah, sure.
but obviously you see that you're not the only author here. Right? That there are many different, because I also show them where the gravity, let's say the rigid body collision algorithm that I use in platform comes from. It's a, you know, because it has a history too. It comes from like NVIDIA physics. Before that, there was another company that kind of like bullet physics and so.
And it's
You
like, I
cannot-
mean, the blob architecture of the 90s was basically Maya. And it was
Yeah.
so trivial from our standpoint nowadays. There they have way more ways of interaction in your tool than they had in Maya in the 90s.
Yeah, but
Because of the ideas you have developed as well.
so, but this is what I try to say with this work is that the ideas, they don't come before. You know, ideas come from when you actually have access to something, and this is like important for them because it's not, you know, it's many students in my class, they come from two different schools of thought, like pedagogically speaking. One is this modernist heritage that we all come from, I think, which is like form follows function, and that's kind of a simple thing to say, but it's actually so profound because then when I ask them to make a color drawing, you know, in the beginning, just put some color. They make a color drawing that has separate colors for separate shapes, you know, and this is you would think that this is just a trivial thing, but this is how this idea of form follows function embeds itself into thinking, because they cannot think about color outside of this idea that every object has its own separate thing because it has to be defined, like in urbanism, you know, this color goes here, this color goes there. It's a functionless idea of color, which then takes away like 90% of what you can do with anything. So the same thing when I told them in the beginning, let's make a Rhino model and then make a section from a Rhino model. They all come with these sections, you know, and when you cut a Rhino model, a section is a thin line, right? And I tell them this is how you think about space, you know, like a bubble diagram, like soap bubble. So there is no thickness in your world, it's just that everything becomes a thin line, and this is because they become so used to these ideas that are there, and they just reproduce them, you know. So, and that's what I'm fighting against, I guess. Like that's why I'm inverting these positions, because I don't want them to make Rhino sections. I don't want them to make functionalist color, you know. I want them to think about what they're doing, and even if it looks completely useless or whatever, you know, it doesn't matter, because they will go through this process of like considering that all the things that they actually think that they're free in their authorship might be produced already by the apparatus of what is there, you know. And this is what I think about software. Each software has its own default, and if you're not kind of careful, you will end up thinking about space in the way that was given to you, you know, or thinking about like, and if you're not working in space, then I don't know. Like,
maybe final yes or no question. Would you teach that method to a first semester bachelor student, never exposed to architecture?
I would like to try, but I don't know. I don't know if it could be for them. I mean, because obviously we would then have to really talk about. But okay, just one thing. John Haydock had this kind of 9 square grid exercise, and I'm hugely inspired by that. So I would try this, definitely. At least the second part I would try and tell them, just make something, let's talk about. Maybe there will be more interesting things to see. So. But not as an official project. Maybe, I don't know.
Thank you, Damjan.
Thank you. Thank you.